My name is Zach. I'm here with Kaibigan. We are a solidarity organization with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. The National Democratic Front of the Philippines is a multi-sectoral alliance of revolutionary underground organizations that are fighting for the liberation of the Philippines and for the People's Democratic Revolution in the Philippines. This includes all sectors of society, with people being represented as groups like Makibaka for women, with Armas for artists, Kapitaan Makabayan for revolutionary youth and students, and so many more. This encompasses every single aspect of society, and it's really the peak representation of the revolutionary struggle in the Philippines. It's led by the Communist Party of the Philippines, and is seeking to really liberate from US imperialism, bureaucrat capitalism, and feudalism. And so that is our organization. We are in solidarity with the NDF, and so it is our job to propagate not just its programs, propagate the struggle, but also propagate what it's fighting for and the vision that it wants to see in the Philippines, and for how it relates to other countries like the US, for example. And with that, I'll pass it on off.
Thank you, Zach. Can y'all hear me okay? Yeah. Online okay? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy. I am a member of Anak Bayan UW. Yeah. Okay. And I'm here repping BAYAN. BAYAN is a alliance. It's the arm of the BAYAN Alliance in the Philippines. So we are overseas alliance, or arm of this alliance, which represents different sectors in Philippine society that are impacted by the conditions in the Philippines and also abroad. So different sectors include women, includes youth and students, it includes workers, fisher folk. That's just to name a few. And so Anak Bayan is the youth and student sector there, or repping the youth and student sector rather. So we are an alliance of mass organizations who are united and fighting for genuine sovereignty and national democracy with a socialist perspective in the Philippines. So very excited to be here, y'all. Thanks for coming out. Nathan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Nathan. I've been working with Kaibigan, which Zach just introduced. And I'll be back up here in a moment.
All right, thank y'all. We'll have another member of us joining later on for our discussion too. So with that, we'll get into what are we doing here? Why are we holding this this educational discussion? And that's because of this, the Boeing Aerospace Defense and Supplier Summit. Yeah, there we go. Boos, I started hearing it. Yeah, so what is Boeing doing? Why is Boeing holding this in the first place? So Boeing is doing this to consolidate their supply chains and to ramp up weapons production. They're doing this to exploit workers throughout the entire world, not just here in the US, but in every single aspect of the Boeing supply chain that they're trying to consolidate and shore up all the different aspects of that aren't working just how they want it to be. And what are they doing with this? They're reaping profits from genocide, wars of aggression, and counterinsurgency. So the very weapons that Boeing is making here are going towards killing people all across the world, going to Israel right now to commit genocide against Palestinians, going to the Saudi government to attack Yemen, and currently being used by the US and the UK against Yemen, as well as to the Philippine government, to the reactionary regime in the Philippines that is using this to indiscriminately bomb the countryside and massacre civilians, mangle farmland, and kill revolutionary fighters as well. What do we think of that? Do we like that? No, we do not like that. And so that is why Resist US-Led War has called for us to all create a broad coalition of anti-imperialist, anti-militarism, and pro-just peace organizations to link and raise our local struggles and campaigns to confront Boeing on March 12th, but not just on March 12th, but beyond, because we do not want Boeing making their weapons here. We don't want our city to be complicit in genocide happening, in counterinsurgency and fascist state violence. We don't want our institutions where people are supposed to go and learn to build a better world, to go and build weapons to tear that world down. And so that's why we're not just going to stop here on the 12th, but we're going to keep going beyond that. And this is represented by a huge coalition of different organizations right here. So this is the last updated one. If you see your organization up here, can you get a shout out? I mean, I can see mine, Kaibigan, right up there. Anyone else in the room or on Zoom too? You feel free to call it out. ABU Dub. AB Seattle. Sami Doom. ISL, there we go. ILPS, yes, absolutely. PSL. PSL? BSL. Oh, Bellevue Student League. Thank you. I was confused. Thank you. Yeah, so we have so many different organizations, both here online and all throughout Seattle, that are coming together to oppose this weapons summit. And this is just the work that's been going on, led by Resist, US-led war, in the last couple months. Meanwhile, we have buildups to multiple other conglomerations of weapons manufacturers, to military shows and things like that, like RIMPAC this summer, to NATO this summer, to the Balakathon exercises that happen in the Philippines every other year. So please stay tuned. If you don't see your organization up here, or if you're not part of an organization, this is your chance to find one, get plugged in, and join us in this struggle. All right, so from there, I'll pass it right along so we can learn about Stop the Bombing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zach. Can everyone hear me? Just to make sure. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I think this is the title of this ED today, and I think this really links why we're studying, why we're linking the Defense Supplier Summit to the Philippines and the ongoing situation there. So a quick background: Stop the Bombings is a campaign that has been launched by iChirp and friends of the Filipino people in struggle, which is what Kaibigan is a part of. And it's been, it kind of stemmed after like 2017. So under the US Duterte regime from, I believe 2017 to 2022, these aerial bombings increased rapidly. Yeah, so I think what we're trying to do is bring light to the situation. So yeah, I think I'll just give a background of some recent examples. This has been ongoing for a while, I think, but I really want to highlight specifically why this is an issue right now. So we'll get into some recent examples, and yeah. Okay, yeah. So this is just as recent as December 25th last year. This is on Christmas Day. So typically these bombings are targeting the MPA, which is the New People's Army, which operates under the People's Revolutionary Movement in the Philippines. So as recent as December 25th, in Malaybalay City, which is in Bukidnon, in southern Philippines, in Mindanao, there was a massacre, and the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, dropped 250-pound bombs on an MPA camp, and it's actually martyred 10 people. And this was grossly excessive force was used, which led to mangled bodies and large destruction of the agricultural area in the region. And then 2 days later, it dropped more bombs in the town of Quezon, which is just below Malabalay, also in Bukidnon. So yeah, this is an example recently, and this is just the beginning. All of these bombings, they grossly violate international humanitarian law, and the excessive, disproportionate force is really what we're trying to highlight here. So this is only in the past 2 months, from December to February in Bukidnon, which is the area we just discussed. An MPA spokesperson has reported there's been at least 4 bombing incidents. As we can see on February 23rd, between San Fernando and Valencia City, which is also in Bukidnon, there was indiscriminate bombing there. £250 bombs were again used. This piece of military equipment we see in the bottom right, it's called a howitzer. This is actually supplied by the Israeli military, or Israeli manufacturer. And in that situation, again, there was indiscriminate bombing. And then one thing to highlight is that these bombings also don't are indiscriminate. They claim that they're targeting MPA camps or the people, but typically in this case, like in the case of San Fernando and Valencia City, the MPA reported that there was no skirmish, there was no encounter. So these are actually more to terrorize the people. In the case of San Fernando and Valencia City, this is right near the Lumad indigenous peoples, where they occupy, live and live off the land. So this is made to terrorize those people, and actually in that region specifically, mining corporations, foreign mining corporations, want to get involved in that area. So obviously this reduces the resistance that people can put up against it. And then again, in Escalante City, which is over here on the island of Panay, there was a bombing. This was actually using 500-pound bombs. There was aerial strafing, which is low-flying aircraft with mounted like assault weapons. And then also later, I believe 6 days later in San Joaquin, which is on the island of Negros. And again, yeah, I think in this case, fortunately, I think no one was harmed in this one, and the MPA were able to safely retreat. However, it's the people that really suffer in these incidents. And then yet again, on March 4th, also in Bukidnon, in Quezon, and Camarines, we saw another indiscriminate bombing. So who is actually behind the bombing of the Philippines? So every president of the Philippines in the past 60 or so years, puppet president as we call them, has had a counterinsurgency program or operation. And in the case of US Duterte and US Marcos regimes, they've had their own respective counterinsurgency programs, which are actually patterned after the US national security strategy and the US counterinsurgency guide. So they use the word counterinsurgency, but what these really are just large state-sanctioned programs to terrorize the peasant masses, to harm activists on the ground, land defenders. And in the case of the US Duterte administration, there were more than 193 bombings, shellings, and strafing violations. And then just from July of 2022 to the 30th of November last year, this is the number of people affected by each distinctive category under the US Marcos regime. So in this case, we can see that over 22,000 people have been affected by these bombings, just within that over a year period. This is a short video. There's not much footage of these incidents as they're in the countryside, but I think here there might be sound of it. But here we can see an aircraft just going over behind the mountain. And
Thanks.
yeah, so I think I think there's limited footage, but I think we can see like even just the loudness of these explosions is quite damaging and terrorizing to the communities that live around them. So yeah, I think obviously there's material damage from these bombings, and sometimes they're directly targeted at the MPA, as we've seen. But I just think I wanted to pose to the audience and maybe just have a think, like what are the other impacts of these bombings just beyond that material damage? We could do I think, yeah, maybe if people want to just shout out or maybe type in the chat um, anything that they're thinking of. Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. I think there's a lot of, some of these bombings are in the morning before people are even awake. There's quite a lot of trauma there that people are holding. Anything else?
Environmental damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Some of these have caused irreparable damage to the land. And this is land that is used for agriculture. So the people actually are living with the land. And in certain cases, they actually are hitting, dropping bombs on like right next to farms where people are even working. That was in the case of, I think, the one in San Fernando. But yeah, anything else?
Nancy on Zoom says loss of farmland and food, right? The food that people are living off the land. And then Chris also says aerial bombings are often used to terrify and reduce morale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I don't know if people could hear that, but that was, yeah, I think loss of the land and food, and then also just harming people's morale. So yeah, I think definitely those are great points. I think in terms of the morale thing.
There's also like health for like the fumes of like the bombs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was health. It affects people's health, even just like the fumes and the emissions from this military equipment and bombs. It's harmful to people. So yeah, I think those are great points, and I think things we should all consider about how these bombs are affecting the people on the ground. Cool. So yeah, the bombings are just one example of the tools that are used in these counterinsurgency programs, but there are also other ways that the AFP and the PNP, the Philippine National Police, actually terrorize the people. And we have one example very recently, actually. So yeah, I think I've forgotten the date, but this was actually in February, I believe. And this is a new campaign or a recent event, the Boho massacre. So we've launched Justice for the Bila 5. So in this instance, these 5 people, Domingo Compok, Hannah Cecista, Paulito Historia, Marlon Omosura, and Alberto Sancho, were brutally tortured and murdered in Boho. This incident originally occurred after there was an arrest warrant for Domingo Compok, who was tagged as a leader of the MPA group in that region. But Domingo Compok, this picture was actually taken secretly and circulated on social media during the event. But he was a man in his 60s with severe arthritis. And then also during this event, or prior to this event actually, a common thing, a tactic that's used by the AFP is they try to get like the local population to determine where these people are. In this case, 3 people were actually captured and abducted by the AFP, and their location is still unknown. And that's a father and 2 of his young children, one of whom is 4 years old. And then another victim of this was Hannah Cecista. Hannah Cecista was actually a law student. She just graduated with flying colors from the University of the Philippines, Cebu. She then went to study law at University of Santos Carlos, I believe. And yeah, even while she was studying law, she was working as a paralegal. She was frequently engaged in work for like human rights activism and supporting the people. And then she went to join the peasant masses in this case, but then ultimately was tortured, forced to crawl through mud before they killed her. So yeah, these are all quite tough events to swallow, but I think we really want to tie this in to what we're talking about today. So how is Boeing and the US connected to counterinsurgency in the Philippines? So first, what is the role of the US in all of this? So the Philippines is the largest recipient of US military aid in the Philippines, in the Indo-Pacific region. So 1.4 billion worth of planes, heavy lift helicopters, armored vehicles, small arms and training actually goes to the Philippines. I believe this is between 2015 and 2022. And 475.3 million worth of military or foreign military financing as well. And these, obviously, a lot of this equipment comes from private manufacturers such as Boeing and a few others. But the US government actually regulates the flow of private arms. These are not just private deals. And in most cases, there's actually a public subsidy for these private sales. So they're using our tax dollars to subsidize these sales. And I believe the picture on the top right is the Balakatan military exercise that happens every year. And it's huge in scale. But it's, and all of this is because under the US Marcos regime, Marcos Jr. actually recently signed off on a revised program for the AFP modernization called Re-Horizon 3. And they've already planned to spend 35 billion on military equipment over 10 years. And the AFP's budget has increased by 40% recently. And this has allowed not even just US military capitalists to get involved. The other commonly known imperialists are also involved. So we have sales from Canada, Australia, Japan, and even now we have France, Spain, and South Korea are trying to sell 2 submarines to the Philippines and set up a submarine base. France actually has intentions to create like a visiting forces agreement, which the US uses to already has in place to engage with the Philippines. And Sweden is trying to sell fighter jets. So every country is kind of jumping at this opportunity to sell their surplus of military equipment. And that brings us to Boeing as well.
Thanks, Nathan. All right. So now we're going to get into our least favorite company ever, Boeing. And yes, we just talked about the role of the US, but now we're going to see the way that Boeing is in this mix. And just the through line here is that Boeing, we see, is profiting, right, from their weapon sales to the Philippine government, to the armed forces of the Philippines, which then they use to enact violence and terror onto the people. So this ugly thing up here is the Boeing Scan Eagle drone. And the US sold 6 of these, which were financed through a $13.7 million grant from Washington's Military Assistance Program. And this was part of a larger military assistance like package to other countries, but really want to stress like how insane that number is in terms of our tax dollars that are going to funding this violence overseas. And so this particular weapons technology is used to identify targets for bombing. The bombings that we see happening in the Philippines aren't just random. We are talking about indiscriminate bombing, targeting just as many people as they can. And we'll talk a little bit more too about how the AFP actually targets or actually injures more of its people than it does red fighters. But this particular weapon actually identified targets for bombings in Morawi City, which impacted civilians more, and it killed about 1,200 people. I'll go to the next slide. So this is another weapon that Boeing produces, a JDAM kit, which basically, once you strap it onto like a regular bomb, it turns them into these precision-guided bombs. I want to ask the crowd, has anyone heard of other places where these bombs are used? Yep, exactly. So Boeing, as we know, doesn't just sell weapons to the Philippines, it sells weapons everywhere, including to the Zionist state of Israel, right? To be used against Palestinians. And so we can see here that, when we talk about from Palestine to the Philippines, stop the US war machine, this is what we're talking about here. I'll go to the next slide. So this other ugly thing is a AGM 84L1 harpoon block. And the Philippines bought 12 of these, which is worth $120 million. And so we see this also, this military buildup happening not just against the Filipino people, but intentionally we're seeing a buildup in the Philippines, backed by the US, to prepare for war against China. So in all these different Boeing technologies, we can see that the US war machine really profits its private contractors. And this comes at the expense of Filipinos in the motherland and also abroad. This is why we are here, and this is why it's important for us to confront Boeing, especially its presence in our city. Okay. So we just went through a situation of explaining the different bombings. How many people here actually knew of these bombings before coming here? Can I get a show of hands? We have some people. How many folks haven't heard of this, if this is your first time hearing of it? Yeah. It's not very well publicized. So I want to ask, like, why are there bombings in the Philippines? But then also, what are the conditions of Philippine society? Can people shout out what you know about Philippine society? Okay. Spoiler. Damn. Do I have to present anymore? Okay. What about other examples? What do people know about the Philippines? Agriculture. Okay. Anything else? Yeah?
I know it's really hard to get jobs in the Philippines, so like I guess kind of like problem for these things, like it kind of makes them lose money.
Yeah, not a lot of jobs, for sure. Anything else? Mostly rural. Okay, all right. Yes, those are all true. Go to the next slide. Here's some depictions of what Philippine society is like, right? So, folks are talking about mostly rural, agriculture.
Just from Zoom to repeat back what the folks said.
Thank you. Folks mentioned mostly rural agriculture. We see that a majority of Filipino people, about 75% of the population, are actually concentrated in the countryside. But in the countryside, as you can see, most of these people are landless peasants who are tilling the land using really outdated equipment like these carabao. That's really hard labor happening right there, right? But because they don't actually own their land or like the fruits of their labor, they experience a lot of poverty, a lot of exploitation. And so when it gets dire, they go to the cities to find work. But actually, there's not a lot of jobs, like mentioned before, right? We see that the minimum wage in the National Capital Region of Manila, anyone want to guess what's the minimum wage? Just throw anything out. It can be in US dollars. A little higher, just a little bit. It's about $10. It's about 610 pesos, which is about $10. But on average, a family of 5 actually needs about 1,100 pesos a day, which is about $21 to live decently, to actually be able to afford food especially with inflation. And because there are no jobs, because of a lack of national industry in the cities, where do people go? How are people providing for their families? They have to go abroad, exactly. It's actually systematized forced migration, which is why a lot of us are here, not in the Philippines. About 6,000 Filipino people leave the Philippines every day to find work. But despite this, we also see that the Philippines is the largest importer of rice in Asia, surpassing even China, which is huge landmass. So if we have that many resources, well, actually, before I go into that, our biggest import into the Philippines does anyone know? Exactly. So we're the biggest exporter of rice, but rice is our biggest import. How does that make any sense? How does that make any sense? Exactly. So if there are enough resources, why are the people so poor? Why is it so dire that people are forced to leave or they're forced to take up arms? So if we can go to the next slide. It's because the character of the Philippines is semi-colonial, semi-feudal. 500 points for the person over there. You already know what's going on. Yes, so just want to do a brief share in the analysis of Philippine society. If we can go to the next slide. So what does it mean when we say semi-colonial, semi-feudal? So as mentioned before, majority of the Filipino people are under this feudal system where they don't own their land. It's actually owned by a small concentration of big landlords who profit from their exploitation and use the resources or use the products of their labor for the purpose, actually, of sending it out of the Philippines, like with rice. We see that there's no national industry because the Philippines is import dependent and export oriented. And why is that? It's because it's serving the interests of US imperialism, who need that raw material and will produce it, but not in the, produce it, but not in the Philippines, which is why it is exported. And this is maintained too by, I think Nathan mentioned, puppet presidents. So you see that the people in power in the Philippines, they don't actually care about the Filipino people and keeping national sovereignty, but are actually at the whim of the 1%, the US imperialists, and facilitate this exploitation of the people. So there's some stats here, and I won't go too much into it for the sake of time, but really want to emphasize just the dire conditions in the Philippines, and understand a little bit more about the struggle that's going on in the countryside. So if we can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about some other examples too to really drive home the emphasis on this issue, the central issue, which is that of land. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, who knows has anyone heard of charter change or cha-cha? It's not a dance. It's actually something that many presidents have tried to do over the years, but it's really changing the constitution of the Philippines. So Bongbong Marcos is the latest puppet president who is trying to adjust what's written in the constitution under this guise of trying to make the Philippines be globally competitive in order to solve these issues that we're seeing. But really what Cha-Cha would do is open up the Philippines to 100% foreign ownership and control of the land. So we talked about how the landless peasants who are actually tilling the land don't own it because it's either owned by landlords or it's owned by these foreign corporations who want to open up the land for mining, for example, which is going to cause a lot of environmental destruction. And so really Cha-Cha is going to, it's only going to benefit the puppet, the people in power, the puppet government, as well as the foreign corporations, but not the people. It's actually going to increase poverty. It's actually going to increase landlessness. We can go to the next slide. Another example here that we see in terms of conditions of the Philippines is the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. Anyone heard of EDCA here? Okay. And so what EDCA is an agreement between the Philippines and the US, which gives them, the US troops, access to Philippine facilities, building US facilities, stationing US troops, and also just becoming, like, turning the Philippines into a storage unit for the US government. And why is the Philippines important for US military strategy in this region? Anyone want to share? Anyone? Yes, proximity to China, exactly. As I mentioned before, the US is pivoting in the Asia Pacific and gearing up toward war with China, who is one of its biggest rivals. And so it sees the Philippines as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and really key to their strategy in this region. But this obviously comes at the detriment of the Filipino people and does not actually benefit them. It only increases, also just want to note, it really increases environmental destruction, it increases violence against women, as we've seen, and it is not a solution to the problems that were named previously. It only worsens it. So go to the next slide. So really want to emphasize what it means for people to be taking up struggle under these conditions, as we've seen that whether it's taking up arms in the countryside, whether it is waging mass struggle in the cities under the legal mass movement, we see that fighting for liberation, fighting for national democracy in the Philippines, which we'll talk about later, is really a struggle for land and also for self-determination. And so I want to drive that home in discussing the actions that we see of the MPA, despite what the Philippine government may say in calling them terrorists. We can see here that it is actually very reasonable and quite just to fight back when the conditions are this terrible. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, question for the audience. Talking a lot about the Philippines, and we are not in the Philippines, but that doesn't mean that's not important. So how is the situation in the Philippines that we just described actually connected to the struggles on UW campus? I'm looking at you, UW students. Don't be shy.
I know that UW funds Boeing a lot, and in turn that just funds the struggles in the Philippines.
So the comment from the audience is UW funds Boeing a lot. Anything else?
A lot of our engineering programs here do have direct pipelines to employment for companies like this.
Oh my god. Spoiler alert. I don't even need to present anymore. I'm gonna go home now. Okay. Yes, so talking about how Boeing has a hold too in, like, the different programs on campus and actually serve as a pipeline into the company. Anything else?
the different ways we see underfunding the university for like private interests, like private donations from companies like Boeing, sort of driving the curriculum at the university, is because the state and federal government are not adequately funding sort of a public university, right, and actually directing the program to be less engaged to the people. And so corporations can dictate what we learn and what our programs are and where we get funneled into in terms of employment after graduation. Because that money over the years has continuously been funneled out of education and social services into the defense budget.
Okay, everyone, I'm gonna go home now. But yes, so comment from the back was the federal government isn't actually putting its money to where the people's needs are. It's not actually funding the social services like education, but rather putting that toward military expenditure. Yes, all great, and literally everything I was going to talk about. So if we just go to the next slide. Oh, that's just the title slide. Yeah, so here are some graphs that emphasize what Kasama in the back was talking about. But here is an example of Biden's proposed budget. This right here is military expenditure. This is more than half of the fiscal budget. But then this little slice right here is social programs, which also includes education, but also includes healthcare, for example. And then the other chart to your right is actually taken from one of UW's documents. And here it shows the distribution of funding split between tuition revenue, like what students are paying, versus what the state is actually funding. So in 2003, about 66% of this funding came from the state and 34% came from tuition. But then fast forward 20 years later, we see that state funding has dropped to 38%, and tuition is actually driving more than half of this university's funding, at 62%, which I don't know why they would put this on like an official document as like a pride point, It's actually quite disturbing. Seeing the way that, the state is not actually funding education. We'll go to the next slide. And so really here wanting to point out what folks have been talking about in terms of Boeing's presence on campus, and seeing the way that private corporations like Boeing are using this public institution to subsidize research and weapons production. So who here knows what the BARC is? Okay, what is it? Anyone want to shout it out? It's on the slide. This is a test of your vision. Thank you, Vi. Yes, we hate it here. But yeah, this is a lab on campus that we see like mechanical engineering students are working alongside Boeing employees and producing research, undergrad capstones, and for various things like aeronautics, weapons production, plane parts, for example. And these things aren't just like theoretical, whatever, staying in the university, but it's actually being used by Boeing as a company in their weapons production. We also see that this research that's being overseen is actually helping advance their AI technology, their AI tech that will be used for drones, for example, that are directly related to the development of weapons that can do more destruction. And so, because there's a lack of funding for education by the state, UW also does need, it's forced to get, private corporations like Boeing to fund these different programs. And students and and their labor, as we can see through like the research, are funneled into this war profiteering machine, and are also dragged down into this pipeline. Boeing actually takes advantage of how unaffordable tuition is in order to basically get people to work for them after they graduate and force them in these like predatory type loan deals. So we go to, and like, yeah, also really driving the point, sorry, so sorry, that as we described before, these weapons are used to terrorize the people in the Philippines, our people, as they're used by the US Marcos II regime. So there's a clear connection there. Go to the next slide. I really want to drive the point, especially to my overseas Filipino students, as well as migrant workers here on UW campus, that we are more connected to the struggle that we're describing here in the countryside than just because we're like Filipinos, for example. We're driven away from the homeland in search of a better life because of the conditions, because they're so dire in the Philippines. But when we get here, it's not much better, as we can see, with the way that social services aren't funded, with the way that the labor is also exploited, the way that migrant workers here on UW campus aren't paid livable wages. And meanwhile, we see these institutions and corporations that are actively aiding in the terrorizing, the violence against our people, indigenous peoples, farmers, and activists, and anyone who dares to stand up and fight for a better system, an end to the current system. And so, really, oh my God, spoiler. Oh no. It's okay. I didn't do that transition very well. But yeah, really emphasizing why we are here and why it's important for us, especially as Filipinos, to oppose Boeing on our campus, to oppose Boeing in the city. So we talked a lot about everything that's going wrong, everything that is pretty bad in the Philippines and here. But what is the solution? It was flashed already on the screen. The answer is actually to fight for national democracy with a socialist perspective in the Philippines. And so what does this mean? Oh yeah, we have some fans in the crowd. Okay. Yes. So national democracy, socialist perspective. I'm not going to go too much into depth, but you should take Philippine Society and Revolution with your local AB chapter. The solution to the semi-colonial, semi-feudal system in the Philippines is national democracy, is national because it actually seeks sovereignty. Sovereignty from the Philippines and not being at the whim of foreign domination. It is democratic because it actually seeks to address the root issues of the masses of people and their actual needs, which is land. That's the issue for a majority of Filipinos, as mentioned before. And it's with a socialist perspective that counters what we see in a capitalist society where the fruits of one's labor are owned by 1%, but actually having socialized production and actually being able to enjoy like the fruits of that. And so it's, as we can see, there's a connection to like an actual connection for overseas Filipinos, even if you haven't been back to the Philippines before, with this struggle, which is also why we are not just in solidarity with the struggle, but we are also part of the struggle and waging it here. So I'll pass it to Zach for a little more about what people's resistance actually looks like in waging this fight for national democracy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you. Yeah, so we just got to hear about what's going on here. We got to hear about the weapons manufacturing that's going on with Boeing. We got to hear about the role that the U.S. plays meddling in the affairs of the Filipino people, not just right now, but over the last 100 years. We got to hear about how this is important, not just because we're here in the U.S., but because we are here on the University of Washington's campus that is deeply complicit in producing these weapons, in training up new weapons engineers, and funneling them into the system. And we also heard about those killed by this. We heard about those massacred. We heard about the bombs dropped indiscriminately. Like Tracy mentioned, they are so indiscriminate, they kill more of their own fighters. The armed forces of the Philippines kills more of their own soldiers than they kill New People's Army soldiers. They kill more of their own soldiers than New People's Army soldiers. Can you believe how indiscriminate you have to be? How lacking you plan? How much you have to lack planning? Even with Scan Eagle drones, even with billions of dollars that is getting spent on weapons technology instead of things that can actually go to benefit the people, and they still kill their own people more than those that they're fighting against. We heard about the massacres that have taken place and the martyrs that we've lost. But it's important for us not to just focus on that, not just to focus on how big our enemies are, but how strong the people are together and how the people are fighting back. So some of the ways, we heard also about the legal mass movement that's in the cities, that's here at UW, through BAYAN UW, through BAYAN Seattle, and all the other chapters that are throughout the world. But in addition to those, who's fighting for the liberation? Who's fighting to carry out the national democratic revolution in the countryside, in the halls of power, and outside? And that is the National Democratic Front. And like I mentioned earlier, that includes all sectors of society and is led by the Communist Party. But included in that is also the New People's Army. And included in one of the ways that the NDFP, tries to solve these solutions is peace talks as well. And we can go to the next slide. And when we hear peace talks, we think of capitulation, we think of surrender. That's not what these are. I have some quotes to read you really fast to really flesh out our understanding of what we mean when we say peace talks and what that looks like between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the revolutionary government of the NDF. So, the most important responsibilities of the NDFP include promoting national unity for the revolutionary struggle. It makes pronouncements on behalf of the revolutionary forces upon their authorization. It conducts proto-diplomatic and relations work abroad to gather moral, political, and material support for the revolutionary movement. And so it is actively carrying out this struggle throughout the entire world, building these relations between other revolutionary struggles, between other governments on the planet that see them as the legitimate representation of the Filipino people and the just representation. And on the topic of capitulation and the topic of laying down arms, Louis Halandoni, who is one of the chairpeople of the NDF peace consultancy, who has actually been labeled as a terrorist by the Philippines government, despite the fact that they were engaging with peace talks, said this: "There is and should absolutely be no talk or insinuation, much less demand, about the surrender of the NDFP or of the revolutionary struggle of the CPP, NPA, and NDFP. Peace negotiations are not negotiations for capitulation, but rather unique opportunity to find mutually acceptable and principled ways of addressing the roots causes of the Civil War." The NDF views these peace talks as one of the potential solutions, one of the avenues to change the material conditions of the Philippines. It doesn't just go about these to try to appease the bourgeois rulers in the Philippine government or abroad, but it does so because it seeks every single avenue to improve the conditions of the Filipino people. One of the most recent updates we've heard about this is that they had talks about restarting these negotiations that were killed under the U.S. Duterte regime in 2017. And even since then, the Marcos regime has already stepped up to claim that this is capitulation, that the NDFP is surrendering, and that is not the case. and they stand behind that because they will not capitulate. They will not stop fighting until the root problems of the Philippines are changed. And we can move on to the next slide to take a look at what these peace talks have accomplished so far, actually. So the peace talks first began in 1992, but it wasn't until 1995, 3 years later, that the first agreement was signed, and that's JSIG, or the Joint Agreement on Safety and Immunity Guarantees. And what this does is it protects the NDF and GRP participants in peace talks. It essentially is saying that there will be no infringements, attacks, or repression of peace consultants. This is something that took 3 years to negotiate, and we've consistently seen the GRP, the Government of the Republic of the Philippines, go against this, murder peace consultants, label them as terrorists, and basically smear them in such a way that allows them to do what they please to counter this. In 1998, there's CARIL, or the Comprehensive Agreement on Respect for Human Rights in International Humanitarian Law, which establishes and recognizes the NDF as a legitimate political authority and recognizes human rights with accountability mechanisms. So not just in the Philippines is the NDF recognized as a legitimate belligerent in a civil war, but it's recognized on an international stage as well. And so with that, they also recognize that they need to protect human rights and have accountability mechanisms for this. But once again, we see that because there isn't a legitimate representation of the Filipino people in power there, their human rights are consistently undermined, as we saw just with these bombings, these extrajudicial killings, these forced disappearances, and more. And what is currently, or what is sought to be currently worked on, is CASER, the Comprehensive Agreement on Social and Economic Reforms. And this is ongoing. This is what was being discussed when peace talks were canceled by the Duterte regime. And this seeks to actually address the root causes of conflict, the three basic problems we talked about. Who remembers those three basic problems? Can we shout them out? Yeah, U.S. imperialism, bureaucrat capitalism, and feudalism. So this document, this agreement, seeks to genuinely solve those problems. And it wants to do so through agrarian reform and national industrialization. And so those are some of the major programs. The CASER is seeking to implement the programs of the National Democratic Front through these peace talks. It wants to use every avenue possible to actually fix the problems in the Philippines. And so CASER, if it is agreed upon, if it is able to be put into use, will actually bring about agrarian reform and rural development for the masses of Filipinos who live in the countryside. It'll bring about national industrialization and the progress of economy generally, so that the actual industry in the Philippines goes towards meeting the basic needs of the Filipino people, not towards exporting things, not towards creating markets for international multinational companies to come in and dump their products and exploit the Filipino people more. And it also includes protection of the environment and rehabilitation and compensation for those infected, as we were talking about. One of the key things that these bombings do, as well, is not just intimidate people, not just attack red fighters, but it also destroys the environment as well. And those are just three of the major thrusts of CASER. It is extremely comprehensive. There's numerous documents that you can find online to get more into that, but these are some of the things that the NDFP is concretely working on through these peace talks. But these peace talks aren't the only way that the NDF is carrying out the revolutionary struggle. It's carrying out, in the primary way it's carrying this out, is through the armed struggle in the countryside. And this is being led by the New People's Army and the Communist Party of the Philippines. But when we think of armies, at least when I first started learning about the difference between a revolutionary and a reactionary army, when we think about armies, what do we think of? We think of destruction. We think of killing. We think of what's going on in Gaza right now. Thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of bombs being dropped on civilians. Violence for violence sake, to carry out the interests of the ruling elite. But there's a difference when we understand that the armed struggle is one that is actually carrying out and being led by a people's army. Because with these different things, we know that these different armies that we think of, like the US Army, the Israeli Army, all of these different European armies that have colonized and occupied the majority of the world for centuries, they are doing that in the interests of the ruling class. They're not doing it in the interests of the people. The New People's Army isn't just a fighting force. That's important to understand, but it's a genuine people's army who wants to bring about the development of the Philippines. And it does so by establishing committees for organization, establishing aspects of the economy, defense, health, and education in the countryside that it currently controls, actually. It organizes the masses to launch their own agrarian reforms, to carry out and empower them to change their own conditions. They've been able to already, through strong organizing of the peasants, of women and youth, have been able to lower land rent, distribute land back to peasants instead of cooperatives in the countryside. This is the genuine interest of the New People's Army in the Philippines. It also does this, what we talked about earlier. We saw how cowardly, how disgusting the attacks of the AFP have been, that all that they do is drop bombs indiscriminately throughout the countryside, that they kidnap, torture, and murder people in front of their community. That was one aspect of the BLAR 5 that wasn't included, actually, was that not just were they tortured and killed, but this was all done in front of their community, with others forced to watch. That's the brutality that the AFP is carrying out against the people. Meanwhile, the NPA is trying to actually build up the countryside. When it engages in tactical offensives, it seeks only to target its enemies, the AFP, to take their weapons to build itself up stronger. And that's so important to recognize the difference between this revolutionary struggle and reactionary attacks on the people, is that armed struggle is not inherently bad, it's just who it's in favor of. Because if it's in favor of the reactionary ruling a class, it's going to kill people, it's going to exploit them. But when it's for the people, when it's a new people's army, it's going to lift them up, empower them, build their communities up stronger, and actually defend them against these attacks. We actually have a video to show really briefly talking about what the NPA does in communities.
Itong tatlong sangkap na ito para tayong nagluluto ng isang ulam o nagluluto ng isang pagkain. Kung kulang o hindi sapat yung amount ng mga sangkap na
Gatusan ka mga mag-uusap.
Atong kanunay ginapas kay kung tanaw nato kung dili ta bakit sa pagkunan.
The revolutionary movement continues to build the People's Army, and the peasant movement solve the problem of landlessness of the peasantry and build the people's democratic power, even while the reactionary state power is still entrenched in the cities. The revolutionary movement's struggle to abolish feudalism and solve landlessness is in response to the demand of the peasant majority of the Filipino people for a genuine agrarian revolution. In general, the revolutionary movement, through the New People's Army, works together with the peasantry and their revolutionary mass organizations and discusses and plans with them on how to go about reducing land rent, lowering interest rates on loans, raising farm workers' wages, raising prices of farm products, eradicating usury, and so on. This is enforced by advancing mass campaigns and mass actions. In areas controlled by the revolutionary movement, where the village and municipal revolutionary committees are firmly established, lands, which are often public lands or forestall lands, are distributed for free. At the same time, there is active campaigning for the collectivization of agriculture through simple labor exchange or mutual aid and communal farming. The peasantry is also encouraged to rely on their own strength and unity when fighting for their own interests. But they know that the People's Army is behind them to support and protect them in their fight for land. Today, the anti-feudal mass struggle is surging in many towns and provinces and gaining victories.
Karang mahuman dire sa mga gimbuhaton, balhin na pud sa pikas ng mga area para sa pagtabang sa mga masa.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's one of the most prime examples that we can possibly think of what it means to be a revolutionary force, to build up the people rather than tear them down. Is we saw arm in arm, essentially, with the peasantry in the countryside, farming with them, building with them, learning with them. That's what the NPA is doing right now. That's what they're fighting for, not just to be able to have this, but to have a future where they don't have to depend on rudimentary forms of agriculture, but to actually have development for the peasantry in the countryside, development for the Filipino people, not just for the ruling class in the cities that are like Marcos, who is flying all over the world, spending millions and billions of pesos so that he can eat lavishly. Meanwhile, his people are living in poverty, living in the countryside, being terrorized by their own army. And that's why it's so important that we recognize that while there are other forms of struggle, while it is important to get in the street, while it is important to engage in peace talks, while it's important to lobby Congress people, the primary form of struggle here and throughout the world is armed struggle, because we know that the ruling class has never and will never give up their power willingly. There's never been a time in history that we've seen that, and so we know that when it really comes down to it, the primary form of struggle to engage in is armed struggle like this, but it's not armed struggle that is tearing things down. It's armed struggle to build things up. And so with that, we wanted to close out this portion of the ED with some chants. Kind of a somber, low energy video, but we want to get people going. We're going to have a discussion right after this. So the first one that we have up here is People's War for People's Peace. What does this mean? It means that a war being carried out for the people by the NPA is for people's peace, a just peace, a peace where people are not living in poverty, a peace where people don't have to flee their country in hopes of a better life elsewhere. And so I'm going to say People's War, and you're going to return People's Peace. All right? Can we do that? All right. People's War for People's Peace. People's War for People's Peace. Woo! And there's one other one that we had earlier, actually, that we didn't plan on. But from Palestine to the Philippines, stop the U.S. war machine. I said from Palestine to the Philippines. Stop the U.S. war machine. All right. And now we're going to move on to discussion from here. Yeah, so thank you all for sitting and learning so much with us. Now it's time for us to learn from each other and discuss what we just talked about.
Indeed, thank you. All right, so I'm Violet. I'm a student here at UW, specifically in CS and philosophy. And I am a new member of AV UW, and I'm trying to head this discussion with y'all. All right, is this volume good for everyone? Great. So let's just start off with the first question. We have, how is the struggle of land in the Philippines related to other national liberation struggles? Oh yeah, small group breakouts is actually a great idea first. Actually, so let's for the first like 5 or 10 minutes, or how I like that. All right, Trace gave me a great idea. We're gonna have some small group breakout sessions. So find some friends, some new people around you, form some small breakout groups, And I'll have you guys have about. All right, I'll give you guys 5 minutes to talk about these questions, talk about your own experiences, all of the things that you've seen around you from workers, students around you, and we'll come back and talk about it in 5 minutes. I heard a lot of good conversations specifically about that third question, about the importance of the legal means as well as armed struggle, specifically from some groups around in the corners. Anyone have any thoughts about that? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Well, we were talking about how we were wondering, like, if we could maybe go more in depth about, like, material, like, benefits from those peace talks, sort of, like, for example, like, the government was not abiding by a lot of those, like, agreements they made. So, yeah.
Yeah, to reiterate the question, it's about the material benefits of these kind of peace talks, how they actually can support, especially when governments such as the Philippine government does not respect these kind of peace talks. How do we what's the point? What's the actual benefit? Anyone would like to take a shot at that?
I was just gonna say, we can show people. There are some very simple agreements that we have come to via these peace talks. And, even protecting peace consultants or, international humanitarian law, which, even a lot of, militaries that might die sometimes. The reactionary government in the Philippines doesn't. And so, it's a way that, you can show the masses, who's on the right side. And you'll see, the new People's Army, they have principles that they abide by, and they don't, torture other people. So I think through their actions, we can show people the truth and what the solutions are to most problems are.
Very well put. I personally feel very in touch with that opinion. Sure. Go ahead in the back.
Just to add, I was just on yesterday, and there were these lawyers who do international humanitarian law, as well as friends, the organization that I'm part of. And basically, they were talking about how, in the Philippines, there's a civil war, right? There's this fighting, this revolutionaries and the current government that's in power. And the whole thing about peace talks is that, it shows that the revolutionaries abide by principles, and that the change that they want to see in the Philippines is consistent with just very basic principles that the international community recognizes, right? That it's not like the revolutionaries are trying to sort of do anything that is just sort of wanting to just be their own island, sort of separate from the world. There's actually a government that's developing, a different government that's developing in the Philippines. And so it's not necessarily that for the peace talks to be meaningful. For the peace talks to be meaningful, actually addressing the issues is important, and also showing that when people claim that revolutionaries are quote unquote terrorists, and then when they also claim that activists who are not doing armed struggle are supposedly terrorists, the peace talks show that what these revolutionaries are actually fighting for is not terrorism. There's a very clear program, there's a very clear idea of the vision that they have, and it's no secret to the whole world that that's the vision that the revolutionaries have for what the Philippines should be like.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, any other questions that anyone would like to bring to the collective, to the group?
As for the discussion of peace talks, like we mentioned how they're building a new government, and like that's exactly true. That the MP they have a new government in power. But I feel like the peace talks that are they going to be able to fulfill constructing this new government if they talk with the imperialist government who's then oppressing them and who doesn't want the revolutionary movement to continue? Like we've seen historically, revolutionary movement they can capitulate with peace talks. Like Nepal was having a national liberation struggle as well, and that ended in the early 2000s when they had peace talks, and they ended up just conforming to their own imperialist government, or not imperialist government, but like bureaucrat capitalist government. So what's the difference here? Like, will the Filipino liberation struggle will it be able to realize itself if they have peace talks?
Yeah, I'm also part of Kaibigan. I'm part of the question. I think something that we want to put more time into studying are those documents that have come out of the process of discussions, where the like Supplier, for example, so like what the vision is, like I was talking about, but also what are the agreements and requirements that the revolutionaries have for themselves and their own principles around the peace talks, which I think are different than in some other local contexts. For example, like they don't allow any preconditions. Like they don't allow for the precondition of laying down the revolutionary struggle in order to come to the table to negotiate. And like if you read Casser, what they're fighting for, it shows like the first point there, like what they're negotiating for is the resolution of the root problems too. So I think there's a couple of, we'd like to host more series to dig deeper into these discussions and study those documents so we can, answer some of these questions deeper.
Wonderful discussion so far. Bringing it back to the questions up here. It is an important discussion, of course, but we also have other things we would like to talk about. So, like, for example, like that last point, what are other ways that we can honor the sacrifices of these martyrs that are supporting their community, trying to fight for their roots?
Martyrs didn't get to discuss this. I think one way we can have the sacrifice for martyrs internationally is we have to realize that since like imperialism is like a global system and its headquarters basically is in the United States and we're in the belly of the beast, the best thing we can do for the martyrs, overseas is to develop a revolution movement here. Because if we want to strike at U.S. imperialism, well, let's strike where we live, and we happen to live in the belly of the beast of it. So we have to develop a revolutionary movement here, and that's like a way of honoring people who've fought and struggled against it overseas by keeping up that struggle domestically.
I hope that discussion was very productive, helpful for all of you to just kind of consolidate your thoughts. So, thanks for having me, and we'll pass it on to Grace.
If you have any questions, please feel free to talk to us after. We'll also be tabling in the back, and folks are welcome to linger and continue having these discussions. I know we didn't have too much time, but hope we can continue learning more and talking more together. So we can move on to the last bit of our program here. A lot of the topics were kind of heavy. And we know that this is a reality too, that people are losing their lives, whether it's from being like bystanders in the state violence that we see and the fascism against the people, or whether it's as a result of actually giving their lives to the struggle, to serving the people, especially the ultimate form of struggle, which is armed struggle. So we mentioned before the Bilar 5, but there are so many others too who we're honoring here today. So we wanted to make some space here to remember our martyrs, to honor them. One of the last questions in the discussion portion was, how are we honoring the sacrifices of our martyrs, right? And so wanted to put some names to faces here. It's really heavy, and so really appreciate folks like being here and listening to these stories, but wanted to highlight some folks on the screen, such as we didn't include all the pictures of the Bilar 5, but naming them here: Domingo Compok, Pardito Historia, Marlon Omosura, Alberto Sancho, Hannah Cecista, who's on the far right over there. Also, other folks here who contributed to the movement in their own ways, like Chad Buok, who was a volunteer teacher for the Lumad indigenous youth, for Erickson Acosta, a cultural worker, who also worked among the peasants, for Wilma and Benito Tiamzon, who were peace consultants and also integral leadership to the Communist Party of the Philippines. All of these people really showed us what it meant to be a hero from how they lived their lives in service of the people. Even as their deaths too were cruel and inhumane at the hands of the armed forces of the Philippines. We talked about Ana Cecista, who was so young, who just passed the bar in 2023 and gave her life, gave up her aspirations in order to provide free legal services to the people in the Visayas and to fight alongside the peasants. And just contrasting to the way in which we see the Philippine government and the mainstream media paint them as terrorists, when we can see how uneven and how utterly cruel it is for them, backed by a major superpower, a major imperialist power like the US with all their weaponry produced by Boeing, and seeing the ways in which they indiscriminately harm the people. And they have the audacity, they have the actual gall to say that these people who are actually fighting for the interests of the majority, the interests of the most oppressed, are the terrorists. So true. And so, going back to the question, what does it mean to honor these martyrs? To honor the heroes of the people is also to continue that struggle that they waged, to continue the fight for national democracy with a socialist perspective, for the liberation of our peoples, and really taking up, that call, even overseas, even here. So, wanted to take a breather together. And something that you may have heard if you're in spaces with Filipino organizers, wanted to say, Mabuhay mga martir, which means long live our martyrs. Mabuhay mga martir.
Mabuhay.
Thank you, everyone. Wanted to pass it off to our closing cultural of the evening. What is the cultural? I'll pass it to AB Seattle and friends.
It's actually mostly I love it here. It's mostly ABU Duck folks, so if y'all want to come up. We're actually going to be honoring, on the last slide on the left, Erickson Acosta, who is was a revolutionary artist. Who was a revolutionary artist and a peace consultant for the NDFP. And one way that we can continue, his legacy is by sharing his art. And I think his art is a really good example of, in our new society, what does it look like to have different art forms that are pro people. And so the song is called Balang Araw, and it means someday, and talks a lot about in the Philippines, when we do win and we're living in our society, it'll all be ours. The trees and the factories and the things that come out of the factories. And so really wanted to honor him in this way. So who wants to hold this mic? If you want. Oh my God. Okay, let's get it. I'll help him in tune. It's okay. Yeah, we will.
Ako'y nakasintagan na itong lupa, lupang kinakatakan ng aming magsimon. Ang naluluwag sa kwento ng lupa, ang ito ay sa atin na pag-araw. Kung tayong ay para sa lahat, parang araw, parang araw, parang araw, parang parara. Magawa tumutunaw sa ibang baka, bakang na bumurunga sa mga pagawaan ng pawis na kinakalakan, pawis na siyang tutubo sa lahat ng magawaan. At ito ay sa atin na parang araw, at kung tayo ay para sa lahat, parang araw, parang araw, parang araw, parang parara.
Para sa lahat ng magsasaka, ang mga martir ng sambayang Pilipino, mabuhay pa Erison! Mabuhay! Mabuhay ang sambayan ng Pilipino! Mabuhay! Mabuhay ang pambansang demokratikong Luzon! Mabuhay! Atin ang kinabukasan!
Ang ito ay sa atin na parang araw, at kung tayo ay para sa lahat, parang araw, parang araw, parang araw, parang parara.
Ang tao, ang bayan! Ngayon ay lumalaban! Ang tao, ang bayan!
Thank you, BAYAN Seattle and friends. Yeah, thank you all so much for that cultural. It's so important to make sure that we continue to honor the martyrs of the Philippine Revolution and to do so in a way that promotes a pro-people culture that we build together like that. So thank you all so much. I'm here to close this out for the night, so thank you all so much for being here. But before we go, we have a few different things that we want to make sure you're all aware of. So some calls to action. If you are here today, if you're part of an organization that is not so far on this coalition, you can endorse it here and join the coalition, the No2 Supplier Summit, right here at tinyurl.com/support No2DSS. Also, if you want to support the actual with material aid in putting on this action, you can donate to @resist-Seattle on Venmo to support the campaign as well and preparing for this mass action and future ones. You can sign on to the Philippine Human Rights Act, the PHRA, which is a legislative effort here in the U.S. Calling for an end to all military aid to the Philippines until they are in compliance with human rights. International humanitarian law. And finally, like one of the ways you can get involved, and we'll talk about some more actions and events to attend after this, but you can join an organization. We can't do this on our own. We can't do this individually. We can only do it together. So if you're not part of an organization, join one. If you don't know where to start, talk to one of us here today. Talk to someone from the International League of People's Struggle, talk to someone from Resist US-led War Seattle, and we can help get you plugged in. And mobilize with us on March 12th. That is next Tuesday. It's a Tuesday at 12 p.m. So if you have school or if you have work, no you don't. You are sick that day. You are sick that day, you had to take a day off, something happened, something came up. Cat had a hairball, I don't know. But come out with us on March 12th to make sure that Boeing, all of its lackeys, all of the defense suppliers that are going to show up know that Seattle says no to DSS. Yeah, so here we are, March 12th, 12 p.m., Jim Ellis Plaza at Freeway Park at the Convention Center. Be there to tell Boeing what we think of their war profiteering, of their genocide, and to tell them that they are not welcome here in Seattle. So some other awesome opportunities for some upcoming events is we have the International League of People's Struggle, an anti-imperialist alliance that Kaibigan, the BAYAN orgs are all members of, is putting on its third year of Solidarity School this Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. in the Central District. It's going to be a really awesome event. This year it's broken up into, I think, 4 different sessions as opposed to one weekend as we've had in years past. This is an awesome opportunity to come, build with, meet new community members, learn skills, and just build a stronger alliance, a stronger pro-people alliance together. We have these awesome different topics that we're going to be getting into: women's resistance against war and militarism, ILPS, our Defend People's Struggle campaign, preparation to protest Boeing, DSS on the 12th, and then a mobilization, safety, and security skill share as well. In addition, at the end of this month is the anniversary of the New People's Army. It's the 55th anniversary of the New People's Army. So please stay tuned for more information from Kaibigan coming out about a possibility to support with that. And then we have the International People's Tribunal in May, which I'll talk about in just another second. And the Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle, which is our international alliance, as well as the ILPS International Assemblies that are happening in Malaysia in June 19th through 22nd. So if you join an organization now, that gives you some time to get prepped for this awesome trip we're going to be taking and building with different organizations all throughout the world. All right, and so some more upcoming events. Oh, okay, this is all Soul School. This is all Solidarity School. This is happening Saturday. We talked about it. but it's we have the Rise Up, Women Fight Back Against U.S. Militarism and War. That's going to be happening 10:45 to 12:15. And this is the rest of our run-up. So we have our welcome intro, our orientation to the Alliance, going to be eating lunch together, building together, talking about protest safety, and then our call to action for No2DSS. All right, and so what I was just talking about, the International People's Tribunal is Katarungan, the Filipino people versus the U.S. government and the Marcos and Duterte regimes. This is a people's tribunal, which what that means is it's a quasi-judicial event being put on by the people to expose the international humanitarian law violations of the U.S. government supporting the Marcos and Duterte regimes. This is being put on in May in Brussels by our Kaibigan's Alliance, FFPS, in addition to the International Alliance of Democratic Lawyers. And so we're putting this on to really expose the reactionary regimes in the Philippines on an international scale, hoping to isolate them and show the international community their true nature and not let them be able to have all this defense by the U.S. government, because we know that we've already seen it that the international bodies like the United Nations don't have an actual ability to step in when people need it, don't have an ability to change people's lives when it's most dire. And so we know that we have to take that into our own hands to expose these governments, to expose these regimes, to expose these weapons transnational corporations. And so in May, FFPS and IADL are putting that on. You can support that here. We're asking for support if you're able to, in addition to supporting with Resist and the build up for our No2DSS campaign here. If you're able to spare funds, either cash or Venmo, to support with the International People's Tribunal, you can come talk to me or anyone back at our table back here. But this is a really important opportunity that we have as people here living in the U.S. to really support this exposing what's going on and taking action there. So you can help us out with that through direct funds. And finally, we talked about joining the organization, but there's some awesome organizations that we're here tonight that we're presenting today. So that's Kaibigan, FFPS. If you're interested in joining us, learning more about the solidarity movement for the revolutionary struggle in the Philippines, please come talk to us. Also, for any Filipinos here or online that want to get involved, you can join one of the national democratic organizations that is BAYAN, like Onik BAYAN UW here, Onik BAYAN Seattle and Central Seattle, ABSS down south, and so many more. So please get organized, join an org. Let's join in this fight together because we can only do this together. Thank you all so much.